Welcome, everybody, to this event about the petrodollar and fossil fuel capitalism with Professors Richard Wolff and Yánnis Varoufakis. We are so happy to have them joining us here today. My name is Mike Tedesco. I'm a member of the Political Education Collective that's hosting this talk, but I'm also a doctoral candidate in economics, researching imperialism and unequal exchange. So this is a very exciting event for me. I'll be moderating today's discussion along with co-moderator Shahram Azar, and I'll hand it off to him to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shahram Azar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, where I teach courses in political economy and world systems theory. I'm also the host of the show, The Dialectic at Work, alongside Professor Wolff, where we explore the world of Marxian political economy. I'm really looking forward to this exciting conversation, Mike. What do you think?
All right. Thank you very much. So to start, I'll introduce our speakers and then provide some overview of today's topics before we begin posing some questions to get the discussion going. So, all right. So first off, I'll start with Richard Wolff. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor at the New School's graduate program in international affairs. He is well known as one of America's foremost Marxist economists and founder of the nonprofit Democracy at Work. Yánnis Varoufakis is professor of economics at the University of Athens. He's the author of several books on capitalism and political economy and was famously Greece's finance minister in 2015 during its sovereign debt crisis. So next we'll do some check-ins, which is something this group does for every meeting. We don't have time to go around all the participants and ask for a check-in. So if you're in the audience, you can just put your check-in in the chat. Your messages can include your name, pronouns, where you're calling in from, and just generally how you're feeling today. And a quick reminder about recording. We will begin to record this event now, and the video will be widely shared on Richard and Yánnis's YouTube channel. Participants will not be recorded or shown on screen unless they specifically request to do so by clicking on the prompt in the bottom right corner of the main stage window. And for audience member questions, we'll save those to the end. They should be submitted using the Q&A chat feature found in the right-hand column of the main stage window of the Riverside viewing pane. And, we'll get to those at the end if we have time. All right, I'll just introduce a couple of opening remarks before launching into some questions. So through a series of agreements leading up to 1973, the Nixon administration secured a commitment from Gulf oil producers to denominate oil transactions in US dollars, resulting in what's come to be called the petrodollar system. This provided two main benefits to the US. One, insofar as there would be demand for Gulf oil, there would also be demand for US dollars. This strengthened the greenback as the world's reserve currency and ensured low borrowing costs on US dollar denominated assets. And secondly, surpluses earned by Gulf powers through their sales of petroleum products would be recycled back to the US as those powers use those dollars to purchase US debt instruments. We are now 12 weeks into a war with Iran, which threatens to destabilize this petrodollar system. And despite a ceasefire, we have few signs that progress is being made in the ongoing negotiations. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed with global consequences. Oil prices have skyrocketed, inventories of gas, diesel, and jet fuel are dwindling. Hard-hit nations in Asia have begun rationing. Factories are closing and borrowing costs for governments and consumers are ticking up. Not to mention the direct suffering inflicted on the people of Iran and Lebanon from indiscriminate US and Israeli bombing campaigns. We on the left recognize the dearth of material class analysis in the mainstream reporting on this issue, which too often focuses on the particular decisions of policymakers. We hear that Trump folded to pressure from Tel Aviv, or was tricked into believing Iran would go the way of Venezuela, or even that this is simply a distraction from the Epstein files. However, as good historical materialists, we know that we do not get below these superficial takes unless we identify the deeper structural conditions which make possible the current conjuncture and what that implies about where we're headed. And so we're very fortunate to have our guests here to help us do that today. All right. So I'll just pose my first question. I'll start with you, Professor Wolff. Before we get into some of the specific issues of U.S. hegemony and the petrodollar, I want to start by asking our speakers whether you have general comments on the current moment, and crucially, how you think we got here. What were the material conditions and antecedents which explain why now that the U.S. has started this conflict and for what purpose? So take it away with.
Okay, I'll make my introduction brief. I want to hear what Yani's has to say. I always learn a great deal from him, and I think everyone will. And I want also to leave time for the questions and the back and forth so that we respond to what's in your minds in the way of questions. So my brief overtake is the following. We are at what I think now is a historic transition moment. There are usually several of these, and I don't want to make the point, but I do think, as many of you know if you follow my work, that the extraordinarily exceptional situation in which at World War II, the colonial capitalist experiment reached its peak in an orgy of mass mutual murder, that the only thing that was left standing, protected by the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Pacific on the other, in other words, from Germany and the war in Europe and from Japan and the war in Asia, was the United States. And so in 1945, it reached an absurd nodal point. The war was over, and not only was the war over, but the United States was the only one left standing with an intact economy. The only bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor at the very beginning of the war, and after that, nothing. No damaged factory, no damaged railroads, nothing. On the contrary, the war had enabled U.S. capitalism to recover from the Great Depression, which nothing else it had done had achieved. The war had to be fought in the end because everything else that they tried was hampered one way or another. And so the economy at the end of the war was stronger than at the beginning. Not only had they escaped destruction, they had recovered a capitalist moment, a capitalist potential for growth. And then the greater irony, the growth in the United States was enhanced by being the only way for recuperation from the war in Europe, Japan, and so on, creating an enormous demand without the money to pay for it. And so again, to make a long story short, the Marshall Plan to provide the finances that could then enable the demand to become effective and the boost to American production even greater than it would otherwise have been. This situation, coming at the same historical moment as the decline of the British Empire that had already begun earlier, that had been badly boosted by World War II. One was then finished in World War II. India left, the empire fell apart. The first research I ever did as a young person on the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya, it was another chapter in all of that. And so the American empire fell into its hands. The British, too late, everybody else destroyed. And what should have been understood as a very temporary, highly conditional situation became, in the mind of the American people, heavily cultivated ideologically, as something exceptionally American, uniquely American, that there was something about American capitalism that would not subject it to the kinds of limits, constraints, and so on that we could apply and had applied to most other capitalisms. And my point, why do I do this? Because the petrodollar was one of the early vague recognitions that there were some limits. After all, there was that crisis around then. De Gaulle was taking the gold back, the special situation now in the 70s was a generation old, given what the war was in 45. So it became necessary to shore it up. The petrodollar system, as you nicely summarized, did that. It shored it up. Well, we are at a point now where that empire, the American empire, has reached limits I do not think it is capable of overcoming. I think we are in the decline phase. Every empire in the history of the world has been born, evolved, and died. The American obviously was born. We know that. The American has existed for a while. We know that too. The decline is not a question of whether, it's really only a question of when. And I think we are now in the when phase. It was prepared by the loss, in my judgment, in Vietnam, which changed many, many things we're still not fully aware of in our culture here in the United States. But it was certainly boosted by the defeat in Afghanistan, by the fact of what has happened in Iraq, by the evolution of the Ukraine war, and now in a very dramatic way by this fight with Iran. Of course, we are in the middle of that, so I can't speak about it as a settled matter. But it seems to me it does threaten the whole petrodollar arrangement. Iran is an irreducible reality for the Gulf states that they have to come to terms with one way or another. And I believe we're watching the United Arab Emirates do it in one way, and Saudi Arabia in yet another, and Qatar and Oman, each trying to figure out how to survive what may be coming any day now in the way of resumed hostilities. But with or without them, nothing will ever be the same in the whole world. You have touched the money situation, the currency situation, and above all, the energy situation. These are fundamental pillars of the capitalist empire. I don't see how the United States can hold on. I see, in fact, both internationally, but finally also here inside the United States, the disintegration of all kinds of accommodations that had been made that underpinned the American empire abroad. That consensus at home is disintegrating as we talk. The level of division in this country and the level of hostility attending those divisions are beyond anything I have seen in my lifetime in the United States. I was born here, I've lived here all my life, and I am clearly confronted on a daily basis by shifting political winds I had not expected to live to see. I am sitting in Manhattan, in a city that enthusiastically elected a young Muslim socialist to be its mayor. I don't want to overdo it, but that's a remarkable event in this culture at this time. And it too, if you were to explain it, would build on everything I've just said as its foundation for this moment. So it's a declining empire, and the symptoms are what we are talking about. Those symptoms, and this is my final point, include most dramatically Donald Trump, a character who would not have been the president had it not been for all of these phenomena coming to a head. And what he does and how he proceeds are symptoms of what we're watching. Last week, in 1 week, we had the withdrawal of 5,000 troops, US troops from Germany, and 4,000 from Poland. 3 days later, we were sending troops to Poland. This is a government on the edge of dysfunction. Does that mean we're about to collapse? No. I'm not saying the United States isn't an enormous economic power. Still, it is. It's a decline. It's not the end. It's a decline. But that, I think, is how we have to understand the visit to Xi Jinping, the spectacular behaviors. This is part of the desperate, and that's the key word that keeps arising here, a desperate effort to cope with a declining empire.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'll hand it over to Professor Varoufakis and ask the same question. What your general thoughts are, how do you think we got here, and do you agree with what Professor Wolf has just suggested? It's fundamentally about the decline of American empire.
Well, I'm so pleased to be having this discussion in the context of your introduction before Rick came in. In other words, the fact that we are here conscious of the fact that unless you understand what's happening in Iran as an extension of the class war in the United States and beyond, unless you understand this in dialectical terms, you simply won't grasp what's going on. And I'm very glad that Rick laid down the historical foundations for this dialectical class analysis, starting with World War II. Look, to motivate the conversation, I'm going to start with a puzzle. In the last few weeks, something remarkable happened. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, announced a $20 billion swap line with the Gulf states. To me, that needs to be shouted from the rooftops as a very significant moment. I read the Wall Street Journal, I read the Financial Times, the New York Times. They were talking about a potential bailout for the Gulf states because of the war in Iran. They got it completely wrong. The Gulf states really do not need a bailout. If you take Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council states together, they've got about $6.5 trillion worth of investments, and of which 1.7 is liquid cash, 1.7 trillion. That's 1,700 billion. The 20 billion of a swap line by Scott Bessent is just a pipsqueak. It's not even worth talking about. So why did he go through the motions of announcing it? Because it's not a small thing for a swap line to be offered to regimes like the Gulf states. I'm going to tell you what my interpretation is, but then dress it up, founded on the analysis that constitutes the answer to your question. What's happening is that Scott Bessent is absolutely panicking about the financial circuits of Wall Street. And this is an indication. It's simply a symbolic gesture, the swap line that he proposed, effectively telling people like himself, because remember, Scott Bessent is a very accomplished poacher that has turned gamekeeper. You know, he made a lot of money out of betting against governments. Together with George Soros, they broke the Bank of England. So he knows how that pack of wolves in the markets work. And he's absolutely terrified that they're about to move in against the bond market and against the stock markets of the United States. And why is he worried about that? And as I said, the 20 billion, he knows that it is not worth speaking of in terms of the size of the swap line. It's symbolic. Effectively, he's saying, I'm here and I'm going to bail America out, the American financial markets, not a bailout of the Gulf states. So let me explain that. And now I'm going to, base myself, step on the solid foundations that Rick presented us with. The period between 1944, that's the Bretton Woods Conference, and today, I break it down into three main time frames. The first one is the Bretton Woods period between 1944 and 1971, the 15th of August, the Nixon shock. The second one is between then, 1971, and the great financial collapse of 2008. And the third is beyond that. But for the purposes of our discussion, the petrodollar, I'm going to stick to the first two, the Bretton Woods period and the post-Bretton Woods period. Now, as Rick said, when the United States was contemplating life after the end of the Second World War, the new dealers in power in Washington, D.C. were absolutely freaking out about the prospect of the return of the Great Depression, because they knew that the moment the factories wouldn't be producing aircraft carriers and bullets and munitions and tanks and so on, and the men came back from the war. So, labor demand would come down and labor supply would skyrocket. And they feared that the United States didn't have the capacity as a political economy to absorb all the supply that the gleaming factories that had massively increased their productivity due to the war, could produce. So it was simply a question of, how do we maintain our surpluses? This is without slipping into a Great Depression. And they were talking about 1949. They were predicting in 1944 that 1949 would be a new 1929. And the answer they gave was the Bretton Woods system. In other words, the answer to the question, okay, even if we convert all our factories to produce, instead of aircraft carriers and tanks, white goods and automobiles and Boeing jets and McDonnell Douglas jets, who's going to buy all that stuff? The American economy can't absorb all that. There isn't enough aggregate demand, effective demand for that in Keynesian terms. So the answer was the Europeans and the Japanese. And where will they find the money to do it? They don't have money. The money systems of Europe and Japan were gone. The answer was, we will create them and we will dollarize them. And the Bretton Woods system was the dollarization of Europe and Japan with fixed exchange rates, and a system founded on the revolving around the International Monetary Fund, primarily, and to a lesser extent the World Bank, the purpose of which would be to promise foreign capitalists that, even to the Greek capitalists, that for 30 drachmas they would get $1, as long as they had capital controls, and the American government would determine through the Washington-based IMF how many dollars they would give to the German, to the Italian, to the Greek capitalists. Okay, it was completely controlled, but it was a system that was hinged, which was anchored on the American dollar. Forget the story that gold was lurking in the background because of the convertibility of $35 to 1 ounce. That was also symbolic. It was a dollar. Okay, so the dollar was the anchor that held down a system whereby America's surpluses were recycled to Europe and to Japan in order to maintain them. Okay? And as Rick said, the Vietnam War must not be underestimated, because it was two things: the Vietnam War and the Great Society program by LBJ, which were, of course, related one to another. There was a causal dialectical relationship between the two. But those two things together with the fact that the Japanese and the German capitalists boosted productivity well beyond American productivity, American capitalist productivity. The result was that by 1968, 1969, the United States had slipped from a surplus position to a deficit position. And it was then that Henry Kissinger, who was at the NSC at that time, the National Security Council, before he moved over to the State Department, put a question to his team. He said, how can we maintain our hegemony now that we are a deficit country? And a young man called Paul Volcker, who worked for him at the time, 1970, slipped him a note and said, we'll make the capitalists of the rest of the world pay for our deficits. We have to increase our deficits and have the capitalists of the rest of the world pay for them. And this is the post-1971 period, the period of financialization, neoliberalism, all those words that we use often, with good cause, describe a system where the recycling mechanism of the post-war period was inverted. Between the 50s and the late 60s, early 1971, American surpluses were being sent over to Germany and to France and to Japan. And after that, once America became a deficit country, Wall Street was weaponized to recycle the surpluses of Germany, of Japan, and later China. Now, again, as Rick said before, petrodollar, the Arab states, effectively the Arab states, the OPEC states, played a very important role in this, because to begin with, from 1946 to 1947 onwards, under the Truman Doctrine in particular, essentially Saudi Arabia would not have existed without a deal, a quid pro quo between the CIA, between the State Department and the Saudi royal family. You do as you're told, and we will let you keep a substantial part of the oil rents. But of course, it will all be part of the dollar system, which was, of course, absolutely straightforward back then, because even the French franc, even the Deutschmark was part of the dollar system, as part of the Bretton Woods system. Soon after that. The interesting thing, however, was that, remember, Bretton Woods was predicated on capital controls, because Washington wanted to control the movement of dollar funds across the borders of the Bretton Woods system. But because so much money was accumulating as petrodollars in the pockets of the monarchs of the Gulf states, a lot of that money didn't go back to the United States. A lot of it went to London. And that's where the petrodollar market and the eurodollar market, which was a result of the fact that once America became a deficit country, dollars were accumulating in Europe. With every Mercedes-Benz that was being sold in the United States without a reciprocal purchase of a Cadillac by a Frenchman or woman, a bunch of dollars went to Europe, and that accumulated. So it was eurodollars and petrodollars. And that was the chink in the armor of the Bretton Woods system, which was supposed to prevent the free flow of dollars to the rest of the system. And it's the reason why the City of London became significant, and it was not a backwater. To this day, it remains somewhat significant. So, okay, so to cut a long story short, let me answer my own puzzle, the one that I began with. Why is Scott Bessent freaking out? Well, he's freaking out because Trump had succeeded during 2025 to extract from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar. I remember his visits in Qatar, the plane gift and all that. There was something far more important happening behind the scenes, and that was the Gulf states had together, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, together they had pledged, and they meant it, they had pledged to invest $1.8 trillion in the next 18 months. That is before the end of 2027, in AI and other businesses in the United States. That's $1,800 billion. Plus Saudi Arabia, together with the UAE, had pledged to buy weaponry from the American military industrial complex of about $1 trillion. Remember, the US military budget used to be about $1 trillion. Now it's going to go up to $1.5 trillion. Another trillion would come from the Gulf states. And that would have been spent within 2026, early 2027. Together, we're talking about nearly $3 trillion that was about to flow to Wall Street from the Gulf states. That's gone. And it's gone because the Gulf states have lost their liquidity. They're not selling enough oil, but it's not just oil. You know, Dubai has diversified from oil to a very large extent. They are into the business of trading gold. Most of Indian gold is being traded through Dubai. Hotels, I mean, it's a huge tourist business. They are running at 10%, of their capacity. 90% of the rooms are empty. They are running. I mean, they've got, as I said before, they've got something like almost $6 trillion worth of American dollars. But that's a stock. It's a stock of dollars, right? It's not a flow. Money, the 2.8 trillions that they had pledged to Bessent or to Trump for this year, that was a flow, and that flow dried up. And Scott Bessent does his mathematics, and he can see that if you deny Wall Street 1.5, 1.6 trillion in a period of 18 months, during a period when they are going haywire with expenditure. I mean, there's a huge bubble. Everybody knows it's a bubble. Everybody knows it's going to burst. But as always with bubbles, you never know when the bursting is going to take place. It is impossible. It's mathematic. You can prove mathematically that it's impossible to predict when it will burst. And he's really worried that with this bubble in Wall Street, you take out $1.5 trillion of a flow into Wall Street, and people will go, excuse the Australianism, apeshit. And you know, this swap line was essentially his little message to financiers. I'm here, I'm willing and ready to print as much as, you know, dollars as is necessary in order to prop you guys up. While at the very same time, the companies in which most people work in the United States, the blue-collar workers, are being bled dry. If you look at consumer good companies, corporations, even pharmaceuticals, you will find transport companies, you'll find that they are tanking in the United States. AI is being propped up through the bubble, the self-perpetuating bubble, through Scott Besson's symbolic messages, and thus the point I made at the beginning that this is a very definitive, very vicious class war that is raging within the MAGA movement, within American corporate capitalism, within American society. It is spilling over to Europe. Now, does this mean that American hegemony is on the way out? Well, look, Rick, I hope it does, because I've been looking forward to the waning of American hegemony since I was 10, or maybe 8. But again, it's the same as with a bubble. You know it's going to burst. You know American hegemony is a goner, but you don't know when it's going to happen. And as Keynes very pithily said once, the markets can stay irrational longer than I can stay solvent.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick and Yánnis, for that lovely historical context and setting the stage. I wanted to connect with some of the thematics that both Rick and Yánnis discussed and ask a slightly different question. Because Marxian economists throughout the 20th century maintained that World War I as well as World War II were connected, that war in general was connected with the logic of capital and systemic accumulation. The 1973 crisis, for example, Giovanni Arrighi, Wallerstein, etc., thought about that crisis as a crisis of accumulation. So I wanted to ask you, because I wanted to benefit from the presence of two eminent thinkers of that particular field, the impact of this particular war. Number one, do you see this as a crisis of capitalism in the terminal sense, in the sense of systemic accumulation, the Giovanni Arrighi, Wallerstein kind of thing? And obviously the impact of this war is going to be felt around the world, not just in the USA and Europe, but around the world, economically, politically, strategically. And we've already seen oil prices surging. Fuel shortages, particularly in Asia, have led to rationing and all the rest of it. The CPI report also reflects this particular fact. So what can we expect the medium to long-term effects of this? And crucially, how will these interact with the already existing vulnerabilities and disparities in the global system as a whole? Professor Wolf and then Professor Varoufakis.
Well, you know, my first reaction to listening to you pose the question is that neither I nor Yánnis spoke about something which now in my head has to be inserted into this conversation. And that is the extraordinary rise and power of the People's Republic of China. It seems to me it changes everything. It introduces into a discussion. Look at the way both Yánnis and I focused on World War II. Well, that's a kind of Eurocentrism, and then the Euro-American centrism. The remarkable thing is that Europe, and Yánnis can speak to this, of course, much better than I, but for me, much more than the decline of American hegemony, is the virtual disintegration of Europe. I feel as though I'm watching a hysterical scapegoatism. You know, I've been struck in the United States with the scapegoating of the immigrant. But in Europe, the combination of scapegoating an immigrant and now the kind of wholesale scapegoating of Russia, and I'm I'm not defending Putin or Russia here, but the hysterical creation of a monstrous danger to Europe that can now justify the desperate efforts they are, which aren't working, but which they are pursuing with great intensity as they disappear from historical relevance, becoming a corner of the world, the opposite of the center that they once were. So for me, I want to somehow insert into our conversation, and your question, even though it wasn't about China, sort of just brings me to want to insert all of that. The class struggle here in the United States. Well, one of the central realities of it has been the hollowing out of our manufacturing world. It's all moved, I'm not exaggerating, but it all moved to China. It's gone. We can't function anymore. All the people who over the 19th and 20th century slowly built up an identity, communities, a whole economy around manufacturing. And if you like, the growth of American manufacturing to displace and replace the British Empire manufacturing, all of that was taken away in a relatively short time. If we marvel at China, what an amazing economic development compressed into 3 or 4 decades, what took 3 or 4 centuries in Europe, well, then you ought to also match that with an awareness that in 3 or 4 decades, you wiped out the manufacturing culture of the United States. And that culture became MAGA. They saw in Trump some effort, however vague, that it would all come back, which he kept promising them he could and would do. Of course he couldn't. And so in his first presidency, it became clear to many that he couldn't and he wouldn't. And now it's accelerating that he can't and he won't. And his MAGA is beginning the disintegration that comes from when you have great hopes and you're forced to confront that they are not ever going to be brought to you, at least not by this orange-haired clown in Washington. So I think we are, Yánnis is very right, we are at a point of intense I go on a limb. It's the pre-revolution. It's the recognition on the part of the people that will be in the streets pretty soon. They are beginning now to put together the elements of a general understanding that we need massive, basic change, and that otherwise this is a story of decline without limit.
Yeah, absolutely. I go along with everything you said. Obviously, you will recall that in my introduction, I said that I divide the post-war period into 3 eras: the Bretton Woods period, the financialization period, globalization, call it neoliberal, whatever you might. And then I mentioned another one after the great financial disaster of 2008. So my answer to your question about the crisis of realization, crisis of accumulation of capitalism generally, is going to focus on this 3rd period, which I didn't speak to before. Now, the 2nd period, from the 1970s to 2008, saw to it that the transformation of the American economy into a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into American territory the net exports of Germany, Japan, and China at the same time as their profits. 70–80% of their profits were flooding Wall Street, becoming treasuries, real estate, and shares. So that was a recycling system. Now, this process, stabilized American hegemony, actually boosted American hegemony. For the first time in the history of humanity, you have an empire that gets stronger the more into the red it gets because of this recycling mechanism. Now, that's a unique phenomenon. Many of us missed it in the 1970s and 80s. We thought that because it was getting into the red, that it was going to get weaker. No, it got stronger as a result of recycling other people's surpluses, to use again Paul Volcker's expression. But what that meant was the American working class was being crushed. Factories were being shipped over to China, to Vietnam, to so on and so forth. This was also part of the strategy of driving a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. This was the Nixon-Kissinger project that actually worked really very well from that Cold War perspective. Britain, because of Thatcher and Reagan walking hand in hand, went down that role of deindustrialization, financialization. So the engine of growth in the Anglosphere, in the whole of the Anglosphere, and here I include, if you want, Australia and New Zealand, along with the United Kingdom and America, the engine of growth was the liquidation of pre-existing public properties. And their use in order to power the financialization process, and that went along, of course, with deindustrialization and the importation into the Anglosphere of other people's capital. Therefore, if you look at it from a microeconomic Marxist perspective, right, there is a huge accumulation crisis in the sense, domestic accumulation crisis. Domestic capital goods were no longer accumulating. If anything, there was negative accumulation. But financial capital and rentiers were, laughing all the way to the bank. They were becoming far more hegemonic, and the rest of the world's capitalists were paying for the American military. Yeah, this is what happens. You have the Hermes bag producer in France selling an Hermes bag for $15,000 in New York. Okay, that $15,000 buys American treasuries that buy American army power. So, that was the situation until 2008. For that system to maintain itself, because it was it was an unbalanced equilibrium, or an imbalanced, or a balanced disequilibrium. I mean, call it what you might. And these imbalances had to grow to stabilize that disequilibrium. So the American deficits had to get larger. The crisis of accumulation in America had to get larger so the American rentiers could get richer. While at the same time, the German, the Japanese, and the Chinese capitalists producing, capitalist goods, commodities, were increasing their rates of accumulation, but in American dollars that were invested in the rentier sector of the United States. So it's a tale of two cities here, right? And then, of course, when you give Wall Street billions every day to play with, even if they keep it only for 10 minutes, they find means, derivatives, by which to make a lot of money for themselves through betting. Massive bets over bets over bets over bets. Everybody has in margin call. You don't need me to explain how that happened. And that just collapsed in 2008. And then you have in the United States, but far more so in Europe, and that is the reason why, Rick, this is how I explain the current conundrum in which Europe finds itself, that what happened in the United States was turbocharged in Europe. And what happened? Socialism for the bankers and harsh austerity for the masses. But in Europe, that was practiced to the power of N. I know that, I experienced this. We went, after the crisis of 2008, to save themselves, big business and primarily big finance, practice a form of vicious primal accumulation, primitive accumulation. That is, I'll just give you an example. They came to our country here, and they grabbed all the airports, all the motorways, the railways, the ports, the tax office, the pension funds. They just grabbed it. So, it was a pure colonial thing, and that happened across Europe. At the same time, the European Central Bank was printing trillions of euros, giving it to Volkswagen. Volkswagen didn't invest it because the people were impecunious. They wouldn't be buying Tesla-like cars. And what they did, the good people in Volkswagen, they took the money printed by the European Central Bank and bought Volkswagen shares. This is the reason why Volkswagen cannot produce cars now. So what do? They are transferring whole production lines to Rheinmetall to produce tanks that even the Ukrainians don't want because they are death traps. But we are producing now Rheinmetall tanks in order to keep those industries, to slow down the process of deindustrialization. To produce those bloody tanks that nobody wants, they have to stir up, the Russophobia, the whole thing that, Putin's tanks are about to take Berlin. So we need these, right? So it's a big fat lie, which is functional to a stupid plan for slowing down the deindustrialization process, which is due to the fact that now, back in the 1970s, Reagan, Nixon, and then Reagan in the 1980s, sped up the process of deindustrialization. Capital accumulation in the United States slowed down. Capital accumulation in Europe was going up. Now it's going down everywhere across the world. And here I come to China. The Chinese didn't have this plan from the beginning. In the same way that, take AI, take Huawei, take companies like DeepSeek. They were not planned, really. What happened was that, at some point, Huawei took contracts out to make American models in the same way Foxconn makes the iPhone in Shenzhen, in Shanghai, right? And they learned through learning by doing, how to produce these things, right? And then the Communist Party was very worried about YouTube and Twitter and all those social media, algorithmic social media that are controlled from the United States. And for their own propaganda and authoritarian reasons, they simply erected the firewall between China and the United States big tech. So those companies that were working for the American companies initially and working with Google and all that, they were vassals to the American conglomerates. They had a firewall. They had a 1 billion person market, and they developed their own stuff. And it turns out that it's much better than that in the United States. Electric vehicles, they just completely did everything that was, and of course the 5-year plan, series of 5-year plans was important. And now you have a situation where the only markets that actually do work well are the markets in China. Why? Because they are completely and utterly regulated. Because markets can only work if they're regulated by a proper planning mechanism. This is the great tragedy of the libertarians. They don't understand that. They don't understand that markets without a powerful state planning for them and facilitating them simply doesn't work. And so they made markets work. But at the same time, they're doing things, I'm sure Rick can tell you more about it, that are particularly interesting and quite useful. So for instance, when China's Amazon, Alibaba, by the Chinese version of Jeff Bezos, a guy called Jack Ma, when they were collecting huge rents as a result, in the same way that Bezos is collecting huge rents, they said to him, "You've overdone it. No more than 5% profit rates, rental rates." He had 60 and 70%. So he disappeared for a year. He disappeared for a year, and the profit rate went down to 5%. This is not rent that is coming out of the secular flow of income. That's why you have huge levels of investment. And you have idiotic macroeconomists in the United States, in the West more generally, accusing the Chinese of investing too much. So there, I don't know whether I answered your question or got carried away.
Well, let me just add one more statistic that does that. Part of the mythology of capitalism is to make sure that certain things that are really dysfunctions are made to appear to be extraneous, external, beyond control. One of them is inflation. I love it always. We can't get, it can't go below 2%. The inflation rate in China for the last few years is less than 1%. They don't have an inflation problem. It's none at all. And it's not an issue. It's not worth conversation. And I'm reminded of that because when Yánnis talks about the Nixon shock, that famous speech there in August 15, 1971, the point of that speech was to deal with what was a quite serious inflation at that moment. And Nixon makes this amazing announcement for a Republican conservative, which is what he was, which he says, basically, if you raise to the business community, if you raise any price starting tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in jail. We didn't have an inflation the next 6 months. It turned out that the great difficulty of this complicated thing with the interest rates that have to be all bullshit. It was the Jack Ma moment, although there was no Jack Ma at that point, but it is retrospectively the Jack Ma moment of disciplining. And Yánnis reminds me, because he's Greek, that if you go back and you read Plato and Aristotle, they debated about the market. They both hated the market. Plato said there shouldn't be one. Aristotle said, well, it would be so socially disruptive now that we've had one for a while, that here's the solution: regulate it in an iron regulation, then we can tame it and we can get rid of all of its negatives and hold on to its positive. 1,000 years ago, people understood what has been so carefully cultivated to be forgotten. Anyway, to get back, if I can, to the Iran situation, there is something going on here in which I know Iran is a country of 90 million people. I know geographically, it's like another Europe. I get all that. But nonetheless, it is a poor, what we used to call third world country. And it is now in a position to confront the American superpower. And the American superpower is making one blunder after another. It thought the war could be won in 2 weeks, that somehow they could do in 2 weeks a replay of what they did a year ago in 2 weeks, only with more success. Wrong. They thought the Iranians would fold even if it took a little longer. Wrong. They apparently didn't understand what the Iranians had said, that they would close the Strait of Hormuz and that would have X consequences. When you make too many mistaken judgments, one after the other, it's usually the sign of something else that's wrong. It's not that you can't calculate. It's not that you can't do the research and reach the conclusion. There's something happening that is impeding, and that's what I mean by the decline of an empire. There are too many other things going on, and you can handle it as too many distractions from Mr. Trump or too many contradictory pressures on the American government. There are a number of ways of getting at it, but there wouldn't be a decline if there weren't multiple factors over-determining the situation the country is in. And watching in the last few months as the polling numbers for Mr. Trump come down with a relentlessness, despite everything he is obviously doing to try to reverse that. And now the desperation of using the oil from the strategic reserve to try to limit the amount of increase in the price of gasoline. You're watching a kind of hysteria that I think is very similar, please correct me, Yánnis, if I'm wrong, with what seems to me the Russophobia hysteria that governs the governments of Europe, even as it seems to me as an observer, it is so over the top that whether from the left or the right, the mass support for that Russophobia risks these governments being blown away in the months ahead, the way Mr. Starmer seems to be vanishing as we speak.
Can I just add a wrinkle to this?
Sure.
Look, Rick, America doesn't need, or historically didn't need, to win any wars after the Korean War. American hegemony rose at a time of increasing deficits and losing one war after the other. They lost Vietnam, they lost Iraq, they lost Afghanistan. They are just making a mess of everyone. I mean, they're trying to win everyone. They fail winning everyone, but that's not the point. The point is to have permanent war. Permanent war has so far been crucial to the maintenance and reproduction of American hegemony so far. The reason why I agree with you that Iran is different is, again, going back to something you said earlier, China. Now, take, for instance, 1973, when oil prices skyrocketed. American consumers, American Republicans suffered at the gas station massively. You had these huge queues, you had price hikes. Americans, middle-class Americans suffered a lot, which is, which makes very interesting something that Henry Kissinger wrote in his autobiography. There's a chapter in it which I read years ago, but it's still burnt in my head. It's entitled "Who Caused the Oil Crisis?" And the first sentence of the chapter is, "We did." And the point he was trying to make was, even if we didn't, but of course they did, because remember, OPEC. Yes. The OPEC would never have gone against the United States. Who was OPEC back in 1971, 72? It was Saudi Arabia. The King Saud would have, the CIA could have toppled him in a jiffy. There was the Shah of Iran, who was a stooge of the United States, a CIA operative, and it was Suharto of Indonesia, who owed his presidency to the fact that the CIA helped him kill 1 million communists or people who were accused of being communists. These people had no capacity to turn against the United States. So I believe Kissinger when he said, we caused it. Now, why would you ever cause an oil crisis that dislocates, that damages so much your base, Republican drivers and consumers? Well, the reason that Kissinger puts out there is very consistent with, remember what Paul Volcker had told him: we have to make the capitalists of the rest of the world pay for our deficits. What he was getting at is that, we allowed oil prices to go up. By the way, something that most people forget, oil prices did not go up after 1972 if you counted them in gold. What happened was the Nixon shock intentionally devalued the dollar vis-a-vis gold, and the OPEC people said, well, we are going to get as many dollars as we need in order to continue to receive per barrel the same amount of gold. Okay, I close the parenthesis here. But, why did the United States lose its competitiveness, let's say, vis-a-vis Japan and Germany at the time? China had not come on stream at the time. Well, because German and Japanese manufacturers had managed to increase their productivity and invest more in capital goods than Ford, General Electric, and so on. But they suffered from something that the United States didn't suffer from. They had no access to oil. The United States in 1973 was not self-sufficient, but still there was a lot of oil production in the United States. There was zero in Japan, and there was zero in Germany. And the majors, the oil majors, were American, effectively. They controlled the flow of the oil. So the Kissinger thought there, and the Volcker thought was very simple. We are damaging ourselves, but we are damaging the Japanese and the German capitalists more. So essentially, we're going to win in terms of competitiveness massively, and encourage the German and the Japanese capitalists, and later the Chinese capitalists, to send their dollars to the United States, because we are going to have higher rates of return here, because even though our costs are going up, they're going to go up by less than theirs. With Iran, that is not the case because of China, because China doesn't give a damn. China doesn't depend that much on oil. Their investment in renewables is gigantic. They still have a lot of coal that they get very cheaply, and there's no problem from Hormuz. People say, oh, but China has been purchasing 90% of its oil from Iran. True, but that was only 12% of their purchases. And they have a stock which is 3 times the size of the stock of oil that the American government has in its strategic reserve. On top of that, they have Putin, who is desperately trying to sell more to them. So unlike 1971, 72, 73, when the oil crisis, which hit the American Republican blue-collar base, nevertheless hit the German and the Japanese capitalists more, now the great competitor of the United States, which is China, is not being hit by this. This is why I agree with you that Iran is the Waterloo of Donald Trump.
One more, but then I think maybe we should do the questions or let people, anyway, interact a bit more. When I was my first year in college, I took a seminar, and the seminar was taught. There were 8 of us in the room, 8 young men, and our teacher was Henry Kissinger, and he taught us what he thought about how the world worked. And it was a very interesting experience for me, because it was the first time that I was in the presence of somebody who didn't just talk about such things, but who actually seemed to know. He explained to us how close he was to the Rockefeller family. He told us that over and over again. If you listen to him, his real name wasn't Kissinger, but was actually Rockefeller, even though he is, in fact, from German stock that comes from the name Kissinger, which is in part of Germany, is where this comes from. One of the things he told us is relevant here. The old tribute system, he said to us, the system that is considered ancient history, when one country was required, and he gave us examples from the Roman Empire, to provide tribute to another. He said to us, it will come back because it never left. When Mr. Trump threatened the world with tariffs, do you remember how he alleviated or promised to alleviate, to drop a tariff from 30% to 15% or from 25 to 10? He often did it in the case of Europe by saying, you have to give me, well, what? Well, you have to commit to buying liquefied natural gas, $700 billion, and you have to commit to invest in the United States so and so much. I believe it was around $1 trillion over 10 years or whatever it was. Well, you know, that's tribute.
Over 2 years, Rick. Over 2 years.
2 years.
2.
Gross, even worse. Right. But that's tribute. The real name for that is we will hit you with a tariff, or you give us tribute. That's what you're going to be a political leader. Here's comes my point. You're going to be a political leader in Europe who has to raise money in Europe out of the European economy and then give it to us here in the United States. And somehow you're going to survive politically in Europe doing that. That's an incredible attack on the people you're demanding a tribute from. I want a tribute from you in such a form that it will be political suicide for you to do it. But if you don't do it, it'll be political suicide because I'll close you out of the American market. It's an extraordinary, that's not the step of a confident global hegemon. That's the step of a desperate global hegemon. Let me stop there.
But can I just make a very brief comment on that? You know what? I love him for this. I absolutely adore him for this. I'm so glad he's doing it, Rick, because, I've had enough up to there of American presidents portraying the tribute system as their service to democracy and human rights. This guy comes in there and says, he comes to your home, he says, I like it, I'm going to take it. And if you protest, I'm going to kill you and bury you in the garden. And then sing on your grave, singing hallelujah, right? I love that. For us leftists, Marxists, this is a godsend because, I'm so fed up for decades having to argue with centrists about, the niceties of human rights, of the rules-based global bloody order. We are free of this. We now can talk about brute force, about tribute, about, primitive accumulation, about sheer naked exploitation. It's much easier to appeal to young people, especially because of Trump. We owe Trump a great favor.
Yeah. We're very aware of that here in the United States. He's our best organizer at this point.
All right. Thank you very much for those comments. It actually segues fairly nicely into my next question, which I want to ask you something about something I've seen hotly debated in leftist circles recently. And in light of this discussion about the decline of U.S. empire and how this war is a symptom of that decline, what does this reflect about Israel's role in U.S. empire, given its central place in instigating the current conflict? Does it continue to function to support U.S. control over Middle East resources, or has it become instead a liability to Western imperialism, to the successful extraction of surpluses from the region? If you, Professor Wolf, have comment on that.
Well, for me, I'll try to be really brief here. Israel represents for me a bizarre project that is several centuries too late. For me, this is settler colonialism, and I'm very conscious of speaking to you from the United States because I live in the results of a settler colonialism. What the Israelis are trying to do in that part of the world, Europeans did quite successfully in this part of the world. There is a solidarity, therefore, that makes historical sense between the United States. Look at us. I mean, the difference is the Israelis have been doing it for several decades. This country did it in the first 2 centuries of its very existence. We're endlessly engaged in killing, moving, and decimating the native population that was here before the Europeans came. And it is deep. This is a whole nother discussion, but it is very deep in the culture here, what I'm talking about. As I think we are seeing how deep it is in the Israeli mentality as it is now evoked. And the story I tell very briefly here is a visit I made to a very small community in Massachusetts called Old Deerfield. And the beauty, it's a very small town, and half of it is reconstructed homes from the colonial era. You can walk there and see the old houses filled with the old furniture. It's like an outdoor museum. Very nice, for tourists, very nice. So I went there, I'm interested in history. In front of each old house is a plaque. And the plaque describes an interesting event that occurred in the house. Many of them read as follows. August 12th, 1782. The savages attacked, but we beat them off with our rifles. Next house. The savages stole the horse. As you walk around this little community, you discover its self-identification is its origin in a tremendous battle with the savages. No tablet even remotely suggests that if the Europeans come and kill off everybody they find, if you're going to use the word savage, it applies to the Europeans, not to the local people. Who's a savage here? But it becomes, and pardon my Hegelianism, if you are a savage, it's very tempting to project your savagery onto an other. American history is the history of one savaging of the other, usually a victim, after another. Black people, now immigrants, the Japanese during the war, on and on. This is a country that has to have an other, is engaged in fighting, and who are savage. I listen to people that are spokespersons for what the Israelis are doing, and their speech about Palestinians is about savages who they're not really people. You can kill them in large numbers and they remain the savages who you have to kill. It becomes the logic of a settler colonialism that is slowly, or maybe not so slowly, recognizing that in order to realize its project, it has to literally erase the people that are there, either move them or kill them, but get them out of the story one way or another. And, several centuries ago, this was a workable project. Horrible, but workable. But we now live in the post-colonial, or if you like, anti-colonial period of modern history. We've been in it for a century, is not going away, and that project in this century cannot work. And I think it's just a sad spectacle in which the Israelis are self-destructing and taking a lot of people down with them.
Well, to endorse fully everything Rick said, let me just add a vignette from Australia, because when the British arrived in what is today New South Wales, they perused the land. They loved it. They wanted it. There were 5 million Aborigines there. They said, well, we will declare it terra nullius, an empty land, a land without a people, for a people without a land. And of course, once you look at 5 million humans and you say these are not, they're not here, that's the first step towards genocide. And, it's no accident that the Zionist mantra is a land without a people for a people without a land. So I'm just endorsing fully what Rick said. But allow me to answer your question directly. You asked whether, Israel is good for American capitalism or imperialism, right? Well, it is. It's really very good for American imperialism. It's not good for American society. It is not good for 99% of Americans, but it is really very good for the military-industrial complex and for projecting its power, the power of the military-industrial complex, not so much of Washington, D.C., across Western Asia. Now, what has happened is that at some point the tail started wagging the dog a long time ago. And it did a lot more so with technological innovations and the technological developments. And here I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story that I keep telling in the last few months because nothing has disgusted me and excited me as much as that conversation I had with a certain gentleman who was sitting on my right at a dinner table. I was in one of the Gulf states. There was a conference on big tech, and I was invited there as the court fool, the village idiot, because of my book Techno-Feudalism, in order to say nasty things to these people there, because they were the managers and directors from Google, from Meta, from so on. And I was there as the fool, right? Shakespeare's fool, which I enjoyed doing. At the dinner after the conference, I was sat next to a guy from Cisco on my left and to another guy that I didn't pay much attention to initially. And I was chatting with a guy from Cisco. It was an interesting conversation. It was about quantum computing. And then at some point, a gentleman, a Qatari, from the opposite side of the table, very rich man, but nevertheless, he thanked me for the work I've been doing against genocide in support of the Palestinian people. And the guy next to me, who I didn't know who he was, I didn't know his name, whom he worked for, he said, Gaza, we owe such a huge debt of gratitude to Gaza. And I said, who are you? And he said, oh, I work for Palantir. And I said to him, well, so you owe whom exactly what? You seem to be enjoying the fact that tens of thousands of children were killed there. He said, no, that was terrible. It was terrible. But, and then he pointed at my phone. I had my phone on the desk, on the dinner table. And he said, you see your phone? It is useless to me because it is stationary. When your phone is stationary, it's not moving, it doesn't produce data that I can use. But if you bombard a densely populated area, intensely, people move a lot with their phones. Those who don't get killed, he said. He was very cynical, but also quite pleasant, during dinner. And he said, so that created so much data for us that we managed to train our AI that a particular agent, AI agent, which we sold, and then I checked and it was confirmed. We sold for £1 billion sterling, right? That's $1.4 billion to the British Public National Health Service. And I said, what the hell was that piece of AI? What did you sell them? He said, when you let's say you're in Manchester or in Birmingham and there is a pileup at the motorway and 10, 15 ambulances arrive at the hospital, there's panic amongst the nurses, the doctors, and so on. So we have AI that helps them create some order out of the chaos of panic. And we trained that anti-panic AI using the panic imprint, this was the expression, from Gaza. I think that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Just a footnote. Every war includes exactly that. Every war, and that's true in Iran now too, is partly utilized by the military, and they plan on this. They know what I'm saying. I learned it from them. Every war is a testing ground for all of the latest technological possibilities because they can't test them any other way. This war provides them these kinds of unique opportunities to test. That's why every war will produce...
Patrick, there is a fundamental novelty here, and it is this. In every war, you have the military-industrial complex that produces commodities, lethal commodities, which then it sells, but it tries them out in the battlefield, right? Or even in the occupied lands. That has always been the case. But their surplus value comes from the commodities themselves using proletarian labor.
Yes.
Here we have something unique, which I keep writing about. That's my obsession with what I call technofeudalism and so on, and cloud capital. Here you've got the work being done. A large part of the work is the actual running around of injured people in Palestine, because it's their movement. Okay, it's unpaid labor. Think of it in Marxist terms. That is actually an input into the capital goods. The capital goods are not produced by proletarian paid labor. They are produced by injured people, people running away from bombs, carrying their dead children. So, you know, this is something new for a Marxist political economy.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in some of the questions from the audience, if that's okay with the two professors. John Schreiner asks, and I'm paraphrasing because it's a fairly long question. The gist of the question is that given this dark and dismal situation that we're in, what leverage do progressives or leftists or revolutionary movements in the imperial core have in this particular period? And specifically, how can we connect these abstract ideas about the petrodollar recycling and all the rest of it into concrete mobilizing, such as the one in the 1990s, the WTO protests and all the rest of it? How can we convert these abstract ideas into concrete movements, particularly in this situation? Rick, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll speak only for myself, although I believe what I'm about to say applies to what Yانیس is doing as well. We're talking about Iran, we're talking about Israel, we're talking about current things. But when we do that, certainly for me, when I do that, I am trying as best I can to apply a way of thinking, a way of posing questions and answering questions. And that way is shaped by a life, in my case, a lifelong engagement with what I take to be Marx's project and the project of the great Marxists that I have learned from since. So I want to be blunt here. If you find what I'm saying or what Yánìs is saying to be interesting, to put together things that you hadn't seen the link between, or ways, please be aware that we are applying, maybe with a little addition that can be called original to ourselves, but in my case, only a little. I'm trying to apply Marxian theory. So my answer to your question is, that's the most important thing I can do. I'm not going to speak for others. I work at organizing politically. I happen to. But if I didn't, then I would say to you that this is what we do. More people in America, where I live and work and where I interact every day, more people are of your opinion, the way you phrased your question, that things are really dark, things are really grim, prospects are frightening, more than ever in my lifetime in this country, much more. And what's missing is your question, what do we do? But the first step is you have to be able to think about it in a critical, where we go from here frame of mind. And that does not get taught in this country. Quite the opposite. We are offered scapegoats. We are offered this, delusions of one kind or another. We are not offered neither the way nor the fruits of the way of posing questions in terms of class struggle, in terms of empire dissolving, in terms of new ways of surplus. Think of Yánìs's latest remark there. These are ways of thinking that are crucial to getting out of the mess. Otherwise, we will have yet another phase of capitalism encountering really serious problems, but also coming up with ways of getting another few decades of life because distracts you in one way or another from what might get you out of this situation. That, you know, every casual dismissal of socialism or Marxism or communism or anarchism, those are efforts of this system to keep you from the kinds of thinking, the kinds of traditions, the kinds of literature that can help you get a way out. That teaching that, I have confidence that if we give the tools to the American working class, it will come up and surprise us with how those tools can get you a way out. We can't do that. There are too few of us. We got to make many more of us aware of thinking in this way.
Professor Varoufakis?
Let me give you an example of what Rick says when he's talking about putting into practice Marxian analysis, right? Everybody's now concerned, rightly so, about AI replacing white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, everyone, everyone, mathematicians, the whole thing. And at the same time, there's a lot of liberal, in American terms, liberal, concern about privacy, about surveillance. Zubov's book, Surveillance Capitalism. Now, we need to dispel all that rubbish. I don't give a damn what they know about me. I know that the NSA has a 3-point tail on me because of my relationship with Julian Assange from back then. I don't give a damn. Let them listen to whatever they want. You know what I care about? I care about who owns those machines. Yeah, that's what the Marxist should be aware about. It's not a question of how do you regulate. You cannot regulate AI. When the engineer who builds an AI model has no bloody clue as to how a particular prompt is turned into an output, how the hell is the state going to regulate what the AI is going to do? You know what you can do? You can socialize the machines. In pure Marxist terms, socialize the machines and, have people work on algorithms that have a social purpose and not the purpose of accumulating the maximum amount of what I call crowd rents. Once you start explaining this to people, once you start explaining to them that, it doesn't matter, what government you have, whatever attempts they put forward to regulate x.com, former Twitter, or Instagram. It's not going to work. It really is not going to work because the algorithm is going to be much faster and much smarter than any regulator. But if you socialize that, if you take it under social ownership, which is not the same thing necessarily as nationalizing it, okay? And we have, the users, we can decide what we want the algorithm to be doing, as opposed to, poisoning our conversations in order to keep our eyes fixed in a state of rage on the screen in a manner that destroys any chance that this can be operated as a public square. Yeah. So ownership, mates. The neoliberals keep talking about property rights, that they are so essential. So do we Marxists. But the question is, who owns what? Then you have the answer of who does what to whom, as Lenin put it.
Fascinating. Gina Angiola, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, asks a question. Could one or both of you comment on how the destruction of ecosystems globally is contributing to the geopolitical and economic chaos of our current times? If you'd like to, one or both of you would like to say something about the destruction of ecology and ecosystems in the same process, in the same vein. People are curious to know your views about that.
Well, the only thing I can add is that one of the lessons I take from the Marxian tradition is a lesson that capitalism is a system, one of whose unique characteristics is the essentialization of profit. Profit is the bottom line, profit is the goal, profit is and teaching every generation the following magic, namely that if you maximize profit, you thereby maximize all that is good in society, because all that is good will be enhanced in the process of maximizing profit. The beauty of that argument is you don't have to look at the rest of the world, concentrate on profit maximization, and all the rest will follow. The whole ecology movement represents to me a recognition, one that survived all of the efforts to crush it, a recognition that the magic is fraudulent, that it was never true, that profit magically maximizes everything else that you have as an object in a reasonable person's life. Your personal relationships, your emotional condition, your ecological environment can be horrifically damaged by that which is profitable. And it can be preserved often by that which is not. And once you open that door, if you allow it to be understood in this way and open you up to all the other externalities. Look at how the neoclassical economics tradition teaches, if you think about it dialectically or with Hegel's awareness, it can't but recognize that which it also represses. So in neoclassical economics, they teach you about externalities without ever allowing you to understand that it's all an externality, you idiot. You're not seeing the point. You have to constrain it because otherwise your premise of profit maximization dissolves.
Absolutely, entirely. Look, to the question, what is the relationship between ecological catastrophe and the latest geopolitical twists and turns? The answer is not much. The answer is not much. As Rick was saying, capitalism is in the business of destroying everything that doesn't have an exchange value. So, the most pristine ecosystems, to the extent that they have no exchange value, they are being used as rubbish tips or as free resources, and therefore depleted. We've known that. That was always the case. But, if you're trying to understand what's happening now in Iran, I don't think that the ecological catastrophe, which is uniform, and it's across the board and it's been happening now for 300 years, as long as capitalism has been with us, helps you explain. What I find astonishing is, suppose that, take the Green Party in Germany. I mean, how can they possibly claim to be interested in the ecology of the planet when they are gung-ho about more guns, more weaponry, more support for the apartheid state of Israel destroying Gaza? I haven't heard a single greenie who doesn't happen to be, involved in the anti-genocide movement, but none of the established Greens, right, have said a word about the fact that Gaza, the ecology of Gaza was completely poisoned and destroyed. There isn't one green shoot left that has not been napalmed out. And those ecologists don't say a word, right? So they can't possibly pose as ecologists. But I have to say again, I'm going to give a tribute to Comrade Donald Trump, because in his first term he served humanity without realizing it when he banned the importation of solar panels to the United States, because the Chinese that produce the best and cheapest solar panels had to send them somewhere. So if you go to Pakistan today, 80% of households have free electricity and not even a connection with the electricity grid. I have it on good authority that dowries include 2 solar panels and an inverter and a Chinese battery. In Ethiopia, because of the crisis in Iran, they banned the importation of every vehicle from a motorcycle to a truck that uses internal combustion engines. So there is a massive transition towards renewable energies that's happening with Chinese technologies across the world because of the madness of Donald. So again, we need this guy. We need to build many statues for him. I'm joking, eh?
Well, there's no need. He is very busy doing that himself.
Both of you spoke about the rise of China. what if we ask a slightly different question, namely that all the world's data and algorithmic control still rests in the mega 7 corporations in the United States? What if these mega 7 corporations, alongside the backing of the US state and policy, can exclude China from the process of data collection and the AI, the development of those large language models? Professor Varoufakis, do you think that that's a possibility, that purely by excluding Chinese companies, for example, DeepSeek and all the rest of it, from the competition, by not letting them operate in other territories and all the rest of it, or banning access to goods, for example, NVIDIA's GPUs and all the rest of it, could that, in a way, act as a counteracting tendency to the decline of?
Not at all. Not at all, Shahram. You saw what happened with NVIDIA chips. Biden banned them. The CEO of NVIDIA accompanied Donald Trump to Beijing, begging for them to get some of his chips, and Beijing saying, no, I'm not interested. Bugger off. We are producing our own now. So every attempt to impede the technological process of China is speeding it up. And if they can ban DeepSeek. DeepSeek is going to continue to function really very well. And in the end, they're going to have... The reason why they didn't ban TikTok, and in the end they had to take it over, was because TikTok was so terribly popular in the United States. Similar to DeepSeek. It will be an own goal if they do that. And even if they do it, in China, AI is being used productively, unlike in the West. In the West, we use it in order to cheat, in order to write articles, in order to write CVs, in order to read CVs, in order for students to produce essays that they never wrote, and professors to mark them without reading them. So it's a cheating device in Europe and in the United States. In China, they use AI to power drones in agriculture, so that every drone goes and deposits one tiny little drop of water or of fertilizer on each root in order to maximize production and reduce ecological damage. Do we do this in Europe? Do we do this in the United States? No. All those valuations, they are all about BS.
Let me add something else. Which you can interpret in a number of ways. It's too late. The cat is out of the bag. The horse left the barn, and you're busy closing the door because you don't realize the horse is behind you, not in the barn. The Chinese economy, when it grew over the last 40 years, developed not just a great place for industry to come, it also put an awful lot of people to work who earned a decent income, making the Chinese market the fastest growing market in the world. Now, fast forward to every business school in the world, teaching the young student of business, if you want to go to where you're successful, then you want to go to where the wages are low and the market is growing. Don't go to, but that is an advice to go to China for the last 40 years, because there the wages are relatively low, and because of their success in outgrowing the West, that's what, the old market of the United States and Europe is a big market, no question. But you're not taught in business school to go to the big market. You are taught to go to the growing market for all kinds of good reasons. The growing market is China. And beyond China, the BRICS. And they are the majority of the people of this planet by a lot. Therefore, you're betting on the wrong horse if you think you're going to constrain this in a nationalistic economic system as opposed to a global one.
Can I ask you this question about universal basic income as an immediate demand of the global left, especially given the onslaught of AI and the possibility that a lot of young people are going to end up losing their jobs and all the rest of it. So if we can produce the surplus through robots and all the rest of it, should the universal basic income, at least in rich countries at the beginning, be an immediate demand of the left, and can we organize around that? Your opinion?
Look, initially when I first read about basic income in the early 1980s, I was against it, as a good Marxist ought to be. Now I've changed my mind. But under conditions. I seriously oppose the idea of a UBI that is funded through taxation, especially through middle-class taxation or working-class taxation. This is a non-starter politically. The only way we can fund it is through the appropriation of the monetary system and of capital. In other words, imagine we create a monetary commons. Imagine that the Fed issues a digital wallet, exactly that which the Genius Act of Donald Trump banned. And they know their stuff. They know where they banned it. We should have it, but under what conditions? If you shift your money from Bank of America to effectively what is a publicly owned digital payment system, you should receive the interest rate of the Fed, the overnight interest rate that no commercial bank can compete against, and you should have absolutely zero charges. And think about that. With every $1 that moves from a private bank account to this publicly owned digital dollar, what happens is that because of the negative money multiplier, a substantially larger amount of dollars is lost to the money supply. The money supply, which under capitalism today is being produced essentially by private bankers. Okay, so in order to keep the money supply constant, you need to create more dollars and to give them to people in their digital wallets. And that's a UBI. I would call it a trust fund for everyone. Effectively, what you're doing is you are nationalizing or socializing the collective capacity to produce money, which now is in the private hands. So this is a Marxist project of appropriating property rights over the payment system. And at the same time, I would want to see the socialization of capital that is in the first stage towards socialism. You can say to large corporations, you have to deposit 20% of your shares in a social equity fund if you want to operate in this jurisdiction. And the dividends that come from that are also part of the funding of the UBI. And the third source for the UBI would be taxes on bads as opposed to goods. So carbon taxes, for instance. Since who's going to receive the carbon taxes? Let everyone receive them. So there, in brief.
Now, all I would add is we make it generalize beyond what Yani's has said. I've never liked the UBI. I retain my distaste for it, partly because it's cut off from what I care about. For example, labor. I don't want UBI to be understood as quote unquote freedom from labor. So in other words, you get the income regardless of what you do. No. We don't give up, and we ought not to, our community, our interactions with one another. But the whole notion of what a young person thinks about when she or he looks into the future, that should be opened up. There is no need to link the labor you do with the income you get. Your labor should be a response to your passion, to your intellect, to the people you love, to the community in which you develop. That's how you rethink how you're going to spend by far your most precious possession, which is your life, your time as a living human being. If we can free you from the labor activity that is held over you as a condition. You want income, you want any freedom at all, well, you have to put in your labor. We know how that works. We know what it means. I want the discussion of your income to be attached to the discussion of how you spend your life, or what in Germany they call the work-life balance. Well, there ought to be a work-life income balance, and these things should be either handled together or handled at the same time, but not leave the whole question of how you organize your energy, your love, your brains, your muscles. That should not be a separate issue from the income. It should not be dependent on the income. It's altogether different. That's my sense of where that desire of the universal benefit, that's where it comes from. It's the same as the desire of poor people everywhere who have horrible jobs that they'd like to have more free time. Exactly. If you go back to the early Marx, remember what he said? I want to spend the morning doing poetry. I want to spend the afternoon going for a walk. I want freedom to mean something as a critique of the system. I want that too. And the conversations around universal basic income lack that most of the time. Having said that, I don't want to be misunderstood. That question is debated. There are different ways of interpreting and understanding basic income. I'm not claiming that my critique applies to all of them. It applies, however, to those I most often encounter.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Professor Yánnis Varoufakis, Professor Rick Wolf. Thank you so much for that enlightening conversation. We really learned a lot. Folks, we should do this more often. For everyone in the audience, I hope you got something out of it. As always, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. Take care, folks.